Hello and welcome to Library Training Services Australia's unit Contribute to Collection Management. Most of you will have read the workbook's introductory section, which covers the idea of policy, which guides the practice within library collection management, and the idea that practice within libraries informs the policy for collection management. So you may be wondering at this stage, what shapes all of this? For the purposes of this unit, we're going to be adopting the idea of the collection life cycle as a model which shapes our considerations in this interactive process. So, the policy consists of a number of elements, the first of which is selection. Selection, as the term implies, is the process of actually choosing items which need to be included within our collection. The collection itself is traditionally conceived of as a collection of books on shelves. We all know that it can be much more than that. There are different forms of resources: digital, electronic, audio, visual, etc., physical resources which can be used to build a collection. But we need to select those items which are going to be included in our collection. Once we have made those selections, we then go through a process of acquisition. That is to say, bringing them into the collection in some form. Acquisition, once it's been achieved, and it's far more complex than it seems, by the way, people, once an item has been acquired, it can then be processed. That is to say, it can be made available within the library. There are going to be a number of steps involved in that, and people working within libraries will already have some idea of what might be involved in that, and we will be unpacking that in considerable detail. Once something has been processed, it's then available for use by the library clients. That is to say, it enters the circulation stage of its life cycle. Now, the circulation stage of the life cycle is something that we would hope that a collection item will repeat many times. A well-selected and properly processed item within a collection will have many iterations of its circulation. It will go through that again and again and again, and ideally that will be maximized by the use of items that have maximum life and maximum durability. But eventually every item will reach a point at which it needs to be deselected. And so we have the final section of our collection life cycle, and it then repeats itself. So we have selection, acquisition, processing, circulation, and then after many iterations of circulation, deselection and revisiting of selection, and the preservation of our collection through the acquisition of replacement items. Okay, let's unpack each of these in as much detail as we can. Selection. Selection is, of course, the process of choosing items to be included within the collection. The selection process should ideally be collaborative. It should involve as many stakeholders as it can, and it should in that way collect information from as many different perspectives as possible about the ideal choices for inclusion within our collection. Many public libraries will have means by which the users can put forward suggestions for inclusion within the collection. Academic libraries will frequently have regular processes by which staff and indeed students can have input into the process. Obviously, different library staff, where they are available, should also be able to have input into that process. So frequently you will see where material about potential resources that's been provided in catalogues from vendors, etc., are made available to most of the staff for them to be able to have comment on, and all of that gets fed into the selection process. Budgets are also considerations within the selection process, and that of course will inform the next stage, which is acquisition. It is going to be limited by budget, and one of the main drivers of acquisition is a value for money. How do we acquire something for our collection that is of the maximum possible value with the best and most efficient use of the available funds? We're trying to maximize the benefit to our users of the collection that we are building through acquisition. Acquisition in and of itself is no longer as simple as it was once thought of. We're not just buying books to be put on shelves any longer. E-books, for example, and other digital formats mean that a library may not strictly even own a resource that its patrons now have access to through its catalogue and its provision services. So acquisition has become less clear than it once was, but is definitely a process. We need to locate the items. Now, their items will frequently be made available by different vendors, and choosing a location from which to source it is one of the tasks of our acquisition team, and they'll be looking at ways of maximizing the value of that. For example, if you are acquiring a textbook for a school library, and one vendor is able to also give you access to a digital format of that textbook without any appreciable addition to the cost, then that's something you might very well consider before making a decision to purchase. Purchasing, as we've already discussed, may have different forms in terms of there being actual physical resource ownership or other forms of acquisition. And budgetary considerations that come into that. One example of that is value adding. Books may actually be provided by vendors with elements of processing pre-completed before they arrive at the library, which of course leads us to our next stage in the life cycle, processing. Processing has a number of elements to it. One is the physical processing, that is to say the covering of books, the adding of labels such as barcode labels and spine labels, and protective covers for those labels, anti-theft devices. In the case of electronic resources, these frequently need to be put into enclosures that protect them from damage while they're being perused and secure them for the benefit of the collection as a whole. Then there are cataloguing considerations. Now, we're all familiar, I would hope, at this stage with the idea that we have library management systems that have catalogues that will follow conventions of cataloguing. We have non-fiction items being listed usually by Dewey Decimal, and fiction items will most frequently be listed by author name. However, just an example of the variations on that, in a school library, it might be possible to take your fiction collection and subdivide it into a number of categories, Lexile based, for example. So you might have early readers, you might have middle school or middle level readers, advanced readers, and depending on the age groups of your school, you might have books that are restricted or selectively catalogued in terms of containing content that students that are ready to deal with adult concepts would have access to, so a senior fiction collection. Cataloging would need to take this into consideration. There's no point in having those sort of subcategories unless your catalog reflects it, and indeed your processing also reflects it. So your senior fiction should be cataloged as such, identified within the user accessible catalog as being senior fiction, and labeled clearly on the spine as belonging to that collection, so in the event that it is misshelved, etc., that patrons are able to clearly identify which section these things belong to. So processing and cataloging, and of course that leads us to shelving, which is the first element of our next consideration in the life cycle, which is circulation. So physical shelving in ways that are accessible to patrons is an important consideration, and we'll visit a number of different considerations in that. Large format items, etc., will need to be shelved in particular ways. But then we get to the checkout element of circulation. Checking out is something that may seem straightforward, but if you think about different forms of library to that in which you are currently working, you can see the checkout might work very differently in different places. Many libraries will want checking out to be done by a staff member so that it's known to be done properly, etc., etc. Others will have found that there is a great benefit in terms of efficiencies of scale by using self-checkout mechanisms where the patrons actually scan items themselves and they're checked out against perhaps an electronic user card reader, etc. Self-checkout has efficiencies but also has requirements for processing elements to be in place, such as the anti-theft elements will probably have to be ramped up if self-checkout is a part of your process. And of course, once you've got returns at the end of that circulation, then reshelving becomes something that needs to be worked on both in terms of practice and in terms of policy. In a public library, for example, very popular recently published fiction will need to be fairly high on the priority list for reshelving. In an academic library, you may have short loan periods against items that are under high use because of curriculum demand. They will also need to be prioritized in terms of reshelving. Not all items need to be reshelved with the same degree of urgency as others. And no item should be reshelved if it is in unserviceable condition, which of course brings us to the link between circulation and deselection. We get to look at the idea of repairs and maintenance to items. When an item comes in and before it is reshelved, it should always be assessed for damage, and where this is easily and cost effectively done, that damage can be repaired. And this is simply part of a maintenance schedule. But if an item reaches the point at which it is no longer cost effective for it to be repaired and maintained, then it becomes eligible for deselection. And indeed, perfectly serviceable items in our collection might also become eligible for deselection by reason of obsolescence or just age. Most libraries will have a policy for weeding or culling the collection, and this is where we basically go through shelf sections and assess them against that policy, looking at the age, looking at the condition, looking at the relevance of items to the uses that the library patrons have for it, and deciding whether or not they should be retained. And if not, then there are all sorts of decisions that need to have been made in advance about disposal processes. Do deselected items or weeded items get passed on to other libraries? Do they get sold? Do they get passed on to charity organisations? Are they de-identified and destroyed? These are all decisions that need to have been made at a policy level and will inform the practice. But once something has been deselected, then of course we reach that point where the cycle begins all over again. Selection, acquisition, processing, circulation, as many iterations of circulation as we can possibly achieve, deselection, repeat. And that is the process that we'll be using to run through our development of an understanding of how we can contribute to collection management processes in this unit. I hope you enjoy it.